September 1941, somewhere in the mid-Atlantic gap. The darkness is absolute, not the darkness of a moonless night over land, but the profound, consuming black of the deep ocean under a starless sky. The only sound is the relentless, rhythmic sigh of the Atlantic swell against a steel hull. Inside, the world is a capsule of oil, sweat, and tension. The control room of U-568 is a tomb of dim red light, preserving the night vision of the crew. Men move in whispers, their faces etched in the hellish glow of gauges. The air is thick, metallic, heavy with the breath of 40 men. Captain Lieutenant Joachim Prius stands motionless, his ear pressed to the rubber cup of the sound gear. For hours, there has been nothing but the distant song of whales. Then a flicker in his eyes, a shift in posture. A faint mechanical rhythm cuts through the oceanic silence, a diesel thrum, the sound of a ship. Alarmums. The single word shatters the silence, electrifying the boat. A metallic clangor erupts as men scramble to battle stations. The deck trembles as ballast tanks roar, blowing compressed air, hauling the boat toward the surface. The commander climbs the conning tower ladder, the hatch spinning open to a blast of cold, salt-tinged air. He raises his Zeiss binoculars. There, silhouetted against the faint gray smear of pre-dawn, is a shape, then another. And another, a slow-moving procession of merchant ships, a convoy lumbering westward like ungainly cattle. A cruel smile touches his lips. He keys the transmitter. In coded bursts, the signal goes out into the ether, a call to the pack. Contact, grid BD-87, course 265, speed 7 knots. The hunters have found their prey, and for the men of the U-boat arm in this moment. In this year, the war is not a struggle, it is a harvest. The Atlantic is their field, and the tonnage of the Allies is their grain. They are the masters of the dark sea, and they are laughing. But their dominion has an expiry date, for in the vast, empty skies above and the silent depths below, a new kind of hunter is being forged, one that will not wait to be found, but will seek, chase, and kill. The era of the lone wolf is ending, the age of the hunter killer is about to begin. The war in Europe was not won on the battlefields of France or the plains of Russia first. It was won or lost on the cold, gray, unforgiving expanse of the North Atlantic. This was a battle without front lines, without trenches, without pause. It was a battle of statistics. And tonnage fought over a 3,000-mile-wide artery that pulsed with the lifeblood of the Allied war efforts. Every tank that rolled ashore in North Africa, every Spitfire that defended British skies, every ounce of fuel and ration that sustained the British Isles had to cross this ocean. Winston Churchill, in a moment of stark and terrifying clarity, would later write, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. It was a merchant's war. The objective was not to capture ground, but to sink cargo, to starve a nation into submission before a single invasion barge could be launched." And into this strategic void sailed Germany's most potent weapon, the Unterseeboot. The U-boat. At the war's outset, Germany possessed only 57 ocean-going submarines, force dwarfed by the surface fleets of the Royal Navy, but what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in doctrine, technology, and audacity. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of the U-boat arm, had a vision. He understood that the submarine was not a fleet weapon to engage battleships, but a commerce raider of the most ruthless kind. His strategy was Tonnagekrieg, tonnage war, sink more shipping than the Allies could build, simple, brutal, and devastatingly effective. The early U-boats, Type VIIs and Type IXs, were not comfortable vessels. They were cramped, vulnerable, and slow when submerged, but on the surface, running on diesel engines, they were wolves, fast enough to outrun most convoy escorts with a range that could take them to the coast of America and back. Dönitz's masterstroke, however, was tactical, the Rudel tactic, the wolfpack. Instead of single boats stalking alone, U-boats would spread out in patrol lines across suspected convoy routes. The first boat to make contact would not attack immediately. It would shadow, reporting the convoy's position, course, and speed to Dernitz's headquarters in Lorient, France. From there, a central coordinator would vector in every other U-boat within range, converging them on the target like a pack of wolves drawing in on a herd. The attack would come at night on the surface, where the low silhouette of a U-boat was nearly invisible against the dark waves. They would slip between the escorts, fire their spreads of torpedoes from point-blank range, and then dive into the chaos they had created, slipping away as the convoy's defenders scrambled in panic. By the fall of 1940, this strategy yielded a slaughter so prolific the U-boat crews called it Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. Allied losses skyrocketed. In June 1940 alone, 284,000 tons of shipping were sent to the bottom. The following month, it was 196,000 tons. The U-boats were sinking ships faster than British shipyards could replace them. The noose was tightening. Britain's survival hung in the balance, measured in the dwindling reserves of food, oil, and hope. The Allies were reacting, but in pieces. The convoy system, a defensive necessity from the First World War, was reinstated, but convoys were not shields, they were concentrations of targets, and their escort groups in the early war were pitifully weak. Composed of a handful of slow, obsolete destroyers, corvettes, and armed trawlers, these escorts lacked the speed, range, and technology to effectively hunt submarines. Their primary tactic was reactive, to depth charge a last known position after an attack. A crude and often futile endeavor. They were shepherds trying to fend off wolves with nothing but noise and desperation. The Atlantic, particularly the vast central area beyond the reach of land-based aircraft, known ominously as the Black Gap, became a playground for Dernitz's wolves. Here, the convoys were naked, exposed, and utterly vulnerable. The hunters were unchallenged, but the very scale of their success was about to trigger a response of unprecedented industrial and scientific ferocity. The prey was preparing to turn. The Allied response to the U-boat onslaught was initially a story of desperation, improvisation, and staggering loss, but beneath the surface of immediate crisis, monumental shift was brewing. It was a convergence of three colossal forces: American industrial might, British scientific genius, and a hardening Allied resolve that would no longer accept the Atlantic as a German lake. The first and most fundamental change was one of sheer volume. The United States, even before its formal entry into the war, had become the arsenal of democracy. With the passage of the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941, a river of supplies began to flow across the Atlantic, but ships were being sunk faster than they could be built. The answer emerged from the unlikeliest of places: the shipyards of Henry J. Kaiser, an industrialist with no prior shipbuilding experience, revolutionized maritime construction, applying principles of automobile assembly lines to shipbuilding. His yards began producing Liberty ships, ugly, slow, but robust cargo vessels, at a rate that seemed impossible. Where traditional methods took 6 months, a Liberty ship could now be welded together in weeks. In 1941, the Allies lost over 4 million tons of shipping. In 1942, they would lose a catastrophic 7.8 million tons, but in that same year, American shipyards launched over 8 million tons of new vessels. For the first time, the arithmetic of tonnage was being challenged. Dernitz needed to sink ever-increasing numbers just to stay even. Yet building more targets was not a strategy for victory. The convoy escorts needed teeth and they needed eyes. The second pillar of the Allied response was technological. Born in the clandestine laboratories of wartime science, the key deficiency was detection. A surfaced U-boat at night was a phantom. The solution was air-to-surface vessel radar, ASV. Initially primitive, by 1942 centimetric radar, powered by the revolutionary cavity magnetron, could fit into an aircraft's nose or under its wing. It could detect a submarine's conning tower or even its schnorchel mast in darkness or fog, stripping away the U-boat's greatest asset, invisibility. Alongside radar came two other critical advances: the high-frequency direction finder, or Huff-Duff, was a network of land-based and eventually shipborne antennae that could triangulate the source of a U-boat's radio transmissions within minutes, every time a U-boat shadow reported to Lorient, it risked betraying its precise location. The hunter was leaving an electronic trail. Underwater, the Allies refined ASDIC sonar, but more importantly, they developed new weapons: the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing mortar that launched a pattern of 24 contact-fused bombs ahead of a ship, allowed an attack without first losing sonar contact. The Fido Mk-24 mine was an airdropped, acoustic, homing torpedo that could chase a submerged U-boat's propeller sounds. For the first time, technology was giving the escorts a decisive edge in the lethal hide-and-seek game. The third pillar was organizational and doctrinal. The Allies realized that passive defense, shepherding convoys and hoping to survive, was a losing game. A new, aggressive philosophy was needed: offensive anti-submarine warfare. This required new type of unit built around a new weapon: the escort carrier. These were not the giant fleet carriers of the Pacific. They were small, hastily converted merchant hulls, or built from the keel-up Woolworth carriers, carrying a squadron of 1220 Grumman F-4F Wildcats or ferry swordfish. Their role was not to fight other capital ships but to provide continuous air cover for convoys, closing the dreaded Black Gap. Aircraft were the U-boat's natural predator, forcing it to dive where it became slow, blind, and vulnerable. From this concept evolved the hunter-killer group. Unlike a convoy escort group tethered to the slow speed of merchantmen, these were autonomous, fast-striking task forces typically built around an escort carrier and supported by 5 or 6 modern, dedicated destroyer escorts or frigates, ships like the American Buckley class or British River class, designed from the keel up for sub-hunting. These groups had one mission: to seek out and destroy U-boat concentrations before they could even reach a convoy. They were wolves hunting wolves. They would patrol known U-boat transit routes, respond to Huff-Duff fixes, and use their organic air wing to sweep vast areas of ocean. They were the physical manifestation of the new Allied offensive spirit in the Atlantic. But all the ships, technology, and doctrine in the world would mean little without one final secret ingredient: intelligence. At Bletchley Park in England, cryptanalysts waged shadow war against the German Enigma machine, the naval Enigma, using a more complex four-rotor machine known as Triton, presented a formidable challenge. When the code was broken, as it was for crucial periods in 1941 and decisively from late 1942 onward, the Allies could read Dernitz's own signals to his boats. They knew where the patrol lines were forming. They could route convoys around them like a man stepping around a puddle, and most devastatingly, they could vector the hunter-killer groups directly onto the waiting U-boats. By early 1943, all the elements were in place: the intelligence, the weapons, the ships, and the will. The stage was set for a climactic confrontation. The U-boats, still confident from years of dominance, were sailing into a trap of unprecedented scale and lethality. The laughter in the Atlantic was about to die in a storm of depth charges, rockets, and relentless pursuit. The wolfpack was not merely a tactic, it was a psychological ecosystem, a distributed consciousness operating across 1 million square miles of ocean. For the U-boat commander spotting a convoy, the immediate, visceral instinct to attack was overridden by a colder, more clinical discipline. His duty was to become a phantom, a silent, unseen. For hours, sometimes days, his boat would trail the slow-moving mass of ships just beyond the horizon, radioing constant updates to U-boat command. This period of shadowing was a unique torture. The crew, tense with anticipation, watched the plumes of smoke, the silhouettes of ripe targets, while their commander exercised an iron will to remain unseen. The reward for this discipline was the gathering of the pack. From isolated steel tubes scattered across the void, a community would form: commanders who had known each other only as voices on the radio or names on a promotion list, would become partners in a coordinated dance of death. The attack, when it finally came, was a symphony of chaos conducted from a shore-based headquarters. Each boat acted independently yet in concert, creating a multi-directional assault that overwhelmed the escorts' ability to respond. For the men inside the U-boats, the wolfpack provided a powerful, if fleeting, antidote to the profound isolation of the deeps. In the dark, they were alone. In the attack, they were part of a pack. To the men on the U-boats, a convoy was a target list, a collection of tonnage. To the men aboard the merchant ships, it was a floating, vulnerable city, a microcosm of the war's stakes. A typical North Atlantic convoy, coded with identifiers like HX-229 or SC-122, was a sprawling, slow-moving entity, 40, 50, 60 ships, British tankers laden with Texas crude, Dutch freighters carrying Argentine beef, Liberty ships stuffed with Sherman tanks and artillery shells, plotted in neat rows, a geometric pattern imposed upon the chaotic sea. Discipline was absolute. A sudden turn, a burst of speed by one ship could unravel the entire formation, creating gaps for the wolves to strike. The men aboard these ships were not sailors of the Royal or U.S. navies. They were civilians. Engineers from Glasgow, deckhands from Liverpool, cooks from New Orleans. They sailed on ships owned by private companies, flying the flags of a dozen nations. They were given a few weeks of gunnery training, assigned a rusty 4-inch deck gun or an Oerlikon anti-aircraft cannon, and told they were now part of the war. Their only armor was the thin steel of their hull, their only hope the distant, weaving shapes of the escort vessels on the horizon. When the torpedoes struck, the violence was apocalyptic. Geyser of cold sea, a flash of ignited fuel oil, the groan of tearing metal. Survival was not a matter of bravery but of brutal luck. In the freezing water, life expectancy was measured in minutes. The convoy system demanded stoic courage of a unique kind. The courage to be bait, to sail into the dark knowing you were being hunted, trusting that the distant escorts and the vast industrial machine behind you would, ultimately, see you through. The Battle of the Atlantic was a laboratory, a relentless cycle of measure and countermeasure fought by scientists and engineers. Each side's technological leap was met by the other's desperate innovation. The U-boat's initial advantage was simple. It could see on the surface, using its periscope or bridge watch, while submerged escorts were blind, relying on the pinging directional pulses of Aztec's sonar. But Aztec had a fatal flaw. A submarine could dive below its narrow beam, into a blind spot close to the surface, or could maneuver to hide in the thermal layers of the ocean, where sound waves bent and scattered. The early depth charge attack was thus a gamble, a pattern of explosives dropped over a spot where the submarine was, not where it is. The Allies' centimetric radar changed the calculus of the surface night attack, forcing the U-boat to dive sooner and stay down longer. Germany responded with Medox, a primitive radar detector that could warn of Allied radar pulses. Then came the Allied Lee light, a powerful airborne searchlight coupled with radar, illuminating boats caught on the surface at night. The German answer was the Schnorchel, a retractable mast that allowed a U-boat to run its diesel engines while just submerged. But it was a miserable piece of equipment, making the boat unstable and filling it with fumes. The ultimate technological escalation, however, was in the realm of detection. An evasion, the Allies, Huff-Duff made radio transmissions perilous. The Germans developed complex cipher systems for Enigma. The Allies at Bletchley Park broke them. This was not a duel of guns alone, but of oscilloscopes, cipher books, and magnetic anomaly detectors. Every patrol was a test of the latest gear, a deadly game where the losers did not simply score lower, they drowned. These three angles, the predatory pack, the resilient community, and the silent war of scientists, define the early battle. But to understand the full revolution, we must examine the men who fought it, the minds that directed it, and the intelligence that illuminated it. Life inside a Type VII U-boat was a 24-hour-a-day siege on the human senses and spirit. 44 men existed in a steel tube, 218 feet long and 20 feet wide at its broadest. Every cubic inch packed with machinery, torpedoes, food, and waste. The air grew thick and foul within hours of diving, a metallic soup of diesel fumes, battery acid, sweat, and the greasy odor of cooking that permeated everything. Condensation dripped from the cold hull, soaking bunks and uniforms. Fresh water was rationed only for drinking. Men went weeks without washing. Sanitation was a chemical toilet, unusable during combat. Dives replaced by repurposed buckets. Privacy was non-existent. A man's bunk was his only domain, often shared with another crewman on opposite watch cycles, the mattress. Still warm from the previous occupant, yet, within this claustrophobic hell, a fierce, almost familial bond was forged. The crew's survival depended on the flawless, silent performance of every man, from the Captain Lieutenant to the youngest mechanic's mate. A single drop tool during an evasion could betray them to a destroyer's hydrophones. This shared, extreme dependency created an elite, insular culture. They were Die Grauen Wolf, the Grey Wolves, the chosen few of the Kriegsmarine, lauded as heroes in propaganda newsreels, but the psychological toll was immense. Patrols lasted 60 to 90 days, the strain of constant alertness, the terror of depth charge attacks, the ringing ping of sonar, the hammer blows of explosions shaking the boat. Lights flickering, gauges breaking, seams leaking, eroded nerves. Men existed in a state of sustained anxiety, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. The bravado of the happy time masked a grim reality for every U-boat sailor who embarked on a patrol. Statistically, only 1 in 4 would survive the war. They lived as hunters, but in the damp, stinking dark, they knew they were also prey. While U-boats and escorts dueled on the stormy surface, a silent, cerebral war was waged in windowless huts at Bletchley Park in England and in the Kriegsmarine's B. Dienst Intelligence Service. The outcome of this shadow conflict often decided the fate of convoys before they even left port. The German naval Enigma machine, especially the four-rotor Triton cipher, introduced in February 1942, created what the Allies called the blackout. For nearly a year, the U-boat codes were unreadable. Convoy routing became guesswork and losses soared to catastrophic levels. The breaking of Triton in December 1942, achieved through a combination of mathematical brilliance, captured cipher materials, and the first primitive computing machines like the bomb, was a turning point more decisive than any single naval battle. It gave the Allies ultra-intelligence, the priceless ability to read Donitz's own operational orders. Now the Admiralty's submarine tracking room in London could see the Atlantic through German eyes. They knew where the wolfpack patrol lines, designated with names like Drenger, Pusher, were forming. Convoys were stealthily rerouted around these deadly ambushes, turning a potential massacre into a harmless passage of empty sea. More aggressively, Ultra provided the hunter-killer groups with their most valuable commodity, a specific grid coordinate, a single decrypted signal ordering U-boats to converge on a meeting point, could be transformed into a hunting order for a carrier group. The U-boat commanders, believing themselves invisible in the ocean vastness, were now steaming into meticulously planned traps. The Germans, though aware of security breaches, often attributed their losses to improved Allied radar or sheer bad luck, a fatal misdiagnosis. This invisible battlefield, where the weapons were cipher keys and probability theory, rendered the U-boat's physical stealth ultimately irrelevant. The Battle of the Atlantic was a clash of two formidable naval minds, each embodying the spirit and limitations of their respective forces. On the German side, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz was the prophet of the U-boat, a former U-boat commander himself from the First World War. He was a hands-on, aggressive tactician who believed utterly in his wolves and their weapon. He commanded from his headquarters at Kerneval, near Lorient, maintaining a personal, almost paternal connection with his captains through daily signals, but his leadership style had a critical flaw: centralization, the wolfpack. Tactic required boats to break radio silence to report and receive coordinated attack. Orders creating the Huff-Duff signatures that doomed them. His strategy was rigid. Find convoy, summon pack, attack, and slow to adapt to the radical changes in Allied anti-submarine warfare. He placed his faith in technical fixes like the Schnorchel and revolutionary new submarine designs, the Type XXI Electroboot, which came too late. Facing him was Admiral Sir Max Horton, a former British submarine commander who took command of the western approaches. In November 1942, Horton was Dernitz's mirror image: pragmatic, ruthless, and an innovator. He understood that defense was not enough. He aggressively pushed for the formation and deployment of the Hunter killer support groups, freeing them from convoy escort duty to go on the offensive. He championed the escort carrier, demanded faster introduction of new weapons like Hedgehog, and instilled an aggressive, offensive spirit into the escort commanders. His famous signal to his captains, "You must be like the sleepless bloodhound," Horton's leadership was decentralized, trusting his group commanders on the scene to act with initiative, where Dernitz saw his U-boats as a fleet of individual raiders to be directed. Horton saw his forces as a system, a network of ships, planes, intelligence, and technology that had to operate as one cohesive, relentless organism. This fundamental difference in command philosophy would prove decisive in the open ocean. The Gauntlet, May 1943. The first days of May 1943 dawned on a North Atlantic that seemed, to Grand Admiral Dernitz and his staff, ripe for a decisive victory. The Triton cipher, they believed, was secure. A record number of U-boats, over 100, were on patrol. New boats with improved anti-aircraft armament were being sent into the Bay of Biscay with orders to fight it out on the surface against Allied aircraft, a tactic known as Die Luftwaffe zur See the Air Force at sea. Dernitz believed his forces had adapted, that the tide was turning back in his favor. He ordered a massive concentration of submarines into the North Atlantic convoy routes, forming powerful patrol lines with determined names like Fink, Finch, and Amsel, Blackbird. But the Allies were reading his mail. Ultra decrypts laid bare the entire German deployment. The submarine tracking room in London saw the gauntlet being thrown down. The Allied response was not to shrink from the challenge, but to meet it with overwhelming, coordinated force. This was the moment Horton's system would be tested. Two westbound convoys, SC-130 and HX-239, were scheduled to transit the very heart of the U-boat concentrations. Instead of evading, they were reinforced with powerful support groups, escort carrier groups like Captain John Walker's legendary 2nd Escort Group and the American-built USS Bogue Group were positioned to intercept the U-boats before they could even reach the convoy. What followed was not a battle, but a systematic annihilation. Convoy SC-130, with its escort group led by Commander Peter Gretton in the destroyer HMS Duncan, sailed into the Amsel line. From the outset, the U-boats were harassed, located by Huff-Duff and airborne radar, and forced under before they could achieve attacking positions. The air was thick with Sunderlands, Liberators, and Swordfish from the escort carriers, their lee lights sweeping the darkness. U-boats that attempted to fight back on the surface were met with a storm of rocket and cannon fire from aircraft. The escorts, no longer tied to a defensive perimeter, hunted with a vengeful fury. Walker's group, a finely tuned team of sloops, perfected the creeping attack, where one ship held the U-boat on sonar while another, guided by radio directions, moved in silently for the kill with hedgehog or depth charges. The statistics tell the story of the slaughter. In the defense of SC-130, 5 U-boats were confirmed sunk. Not a single merchant ship was lost. For HX-239, protected by the USS Bogue's Avengers and Wildcats, the result was the same: multiple U-boats destroyed, convoy intact. The pattern repeated across the Atlantic that month. The Technological and tactical synthesis was complete. Radar and Huff-Duff provided the eyes, Ultra provided the map, aircraft from escort carriers provided the relentless pressure, and the hunter-killer groups, with their new weapons and aggressive doctrine, provided the hammer. On May 23, a liberator of RAF Coastal Command, guided by centimetric radar, sighted U-752 in the mid-Atlantic. The U-boat attempted to man its anti-aircraft guns. The Liberator did not drop conventional depth charges. It fired a rocket salvo, relatively new weapon, strafing the deck and killing the gun crews. Then it dropped a Mk-24 Fido, the acoustic homing torpedo. The crew heard the torpedo enter the water, its motor whirring, hunting. Moments later, a muffled explosion. U-752 sank with all hands. It was a microcosm of the new reality: detection, suppression, and destruction by a single integrated weapon system. The U-boat had no answer. By the end of May 1943, the figures were catastrophic for the Kriegsmarine. 41 U-boats were sunk in the North Atlantic in that single month, a rate of loss approaching 1 boat per day. It was a level of attrition that no navy, no matter how determined, could sustain. The air gap had been closed by escort carriers and very long-range liberators. The U-boat's haven had vanished, the morale of the U-boat arm, once soaring, shattered. Veteran commanders spoke of a new tone in the depth. Charge attacks, more accurate, more persistent, more deadly. They no longer felt like hunters but like fugitives in a suddenly transparent sea. The climax of the campaign, however, would be a decision made not on the bridge of a warship but at a desk in Wolfschanz, Hitler's headquarters. The shockwaves of May's losses were about to force a strategic admission of defeat. The reports flowing into Dönitz headquarters in the final week of May 1943 were not merely disappointing, they were incomprehensible. Veteran commanders, the aces who had built the legend of the Grey Wolves, were reporting not just failure but systemic collapse. U-954 a boat operating against Convoy SC-130, was sunk with all hands, including Dönitz's own son, Peter. The signals told a consistent, horrifying story. Convoys were now fortresses, preceded by a screen of aircraft that found them long before they could see smoke on the horizon. Attacks were disrupted before they could begin. The sea and sky had become hostile, intelligent mediums. On May 24, 1943, after reviewing the devastating loss figures, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz made the only possible strategic decision. He issued the order that marked the definitive turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. In a coded signal to all U-boats in the North Atlantic, he commanded, break off operations against convoys, withdraw from the North Atlantic. The directive instructed boats to disperse, to proceed with extreme caution to safer areas or to return to base. This was not a temporary tactical retreat. It was the de facto surrender of the Atlantic as a theater of decisive operation. The Rudel tactic, the wolfpack strategy that had brought Britain to the brink of starvation, was dead, rendered obsolete by the Allied hunter-killer system, the central premise of Tonnagekrieg, that Germany could sink ships faster than the Allies could build them, was mathematically invalidated. In that moment, the strategic initiative passed irrevocably to the Allies. The withdrawal order did not end U-boat operations, but it transformed their nature. Dönitz, ever the committed believer in his weapon, pivoted to a strategy of technological and tactical delay. He pulled his boats south to the central Atlantic and the waters off West Africa, where air cover was still presumed thinner. He accelerated the deployment of the Schnorchel, which allowed boats to recharge batteries while submerged, making them less vulnerable to radar. He demanded ever more aggressive anti-aircraft armament, turning U-boats into floating flak traps, a desperate and largely futile measure against rocket-firing aircraft, and he pinned his hopes and the dwindling resources of the Third Reich on wonder weapons, the revolutionary type XXI Electroboot and the smaller type XXII. These were true submarines designed to operate submerged for prolonged periods at high speed, with streamlined hulls and advanced sonar. They were meant to render the Allied anti-submarine system obsolete. At a stroke. But the Allied system was not static. It was a learning, adapting organism, the Hunter. Killer groups, their confidence forged in the fires of May, now went on a relentless offensive. The sleepless bloodhounds of the support groups no longer needed to guard convoys as closely, were unleashed into the U-boat's transit routes and operational areas, the Bay of Biscay, the deadly funnel through which every U-boat had to pass to reach its French base, became a killing zone. Operation Musketry in Seaslug saw aircraft of Coastal Command, armed with radar, rockets and homing torpedoes, patrolling in overlapping chains day and night. A U-boat running on the surface to recharge its batteries was almost certain to be detected. A snorkeling boat left a visible wake and a radar signature. The hunters had become so proficient that they developed a grimly efficient routine: locate, attack, document, move on. The turning point was now complete. The psychological mantle had flipped. The U-boat crews, who had once stalked the convoy lanes with a sense of predatory invincibility, now lived in a state of constant, grinding anxiety, every radar pulse on their Medox detectors, every ping of an escort's sonar, every shadow in the sky could herald an inescapable attack. The laughter that once echoed in their control rooms was replaced by the tense silence of men listening for the whir of a Fido torpedo or the splash of a pattern of hedgehog bombs. They were no longer the hunters of the sea. They had become the prey, pursued by a foe that was everywhere, saw everything, and showed no mercy. The Atlantic, once their kingdom, was now a vast, watery grave. The period following the May 1943 withdrawal is often described as the collapse of the U-boat campaign. That term is too passive. What unfolded was an active, systematic, and merciless extermination. The hunter-killer groups, now operating with the confidence of proven masters, embarked on what can only be called a cull. The technology and tactics refined in the climax were applied with industrial efficiency. The escort carriers became the new queens of the Atlantic, groups built around ships. Like USS Bogue, Card, Block Island, and HMS Tracker roamed the sea lanes and U-boat transit routes as sovereign hunting preserves, their composite squadrons of Wildcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers, the latter now carrying depth charges, rockets, and Fido homing torpedoes, formed an omnipresent aerial net. A single carrier group could maintain a 24-hour air patrol over a circle of ocean 100 miles in diameter, an area no U-boat could cross on the surface undetected. The Avengers, in particular, evolved into the deadliest of predators. A typical killer team would consist of a radar-equipped Avenger to find the target, often at night with a lee light, accompanied by Wildcats to strafe and suppress deck guns. The U-boat's options were grim: dive and risk a Fido attack, or stay up and be torn apart by rockets and cannon fire. The statistics paint a picture of a force being erased. In 1942, the Allies sank 85 U-boats, a serious loss. In 1943, that number skyrocketed to 237. The carnage peaked in 1944 and 1945, even as overall U-boat activity declined, with another 241 and 153 sunk. Respectively, the loss ratio became unsustainable. By mid-1944, approximately 75% of all U-boat crewmen who put to sea did not return. Training pipelines could not replace such hemorrhaging of experienced commanders and skilled technicians. The elite, confident force of 1941 was gone, replaced by younger, poorly trained crews sent to sea in increasingly complex, often defective boats, burdened with the certain knowledge of their own likely demise. The hunter-killer group's scorecards read like a ledger of destruction. USS Bogue's group was credited with 13 kills. USS Card's group sank 11. HMS Starling, flagship of Captain John Walker's second support group, participated in the sinking of over 20 U-boats, perfecting the creeping attack into a science, one of the most devastating single Actions occurred on November 1, 1943. Aircraft from USS Card located U-405 on the surface. A lengthy running gunfight ensued, with the U-boat desperately maneuvering and firing back. Finally, the destroyer escort USS Bogue rammed it in a violent, close quarters struggle. Both ships were mortally wounded, but U-405 sank. The incident, fought with machine guns, small arms, and sheer brutality, symbolized the new era. Hunters would close to any range, use any method, and accept any risk to destroy their quarry. For the German Navy, the human and material cost was apocalyptic. Of the 1,162 U-boats commissioned during the war, 785 were destroyed. Of the approximately 41,000 men who served in the U-boat arm, 28,000 were killed, a casualty rate of nearly 70%. The highest of any service arm of any nation in the war. The Grey Wolves had not just been defeated, they had been very nearly annihilated. The sea lanes they had once choked were now wide open, pulsing with the uninterrupted flow of men and materiel. This cleared path across the Atlantic was the single, non-negotiable prerequisite for the next and final phase of the war in Europe, the liberation of the continent. With the U-boat threat broken, the Atlantic transformed from a contested battleground into a secured highway. The sheer, uninterrupted volume of men and material that began to flow from North America to the British Isles in late 1943 and early 1944 was staggering. This was the direct, tangible dividend of the hunter-killers' victory. Entire armies, their equipment, their supplies, and the mountains of logistical support needed to sustain them crossed the ocean virtually unmolested. The build-up for Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, could not have been contemplated, let alone executed. Under the conditions of 1942, the convoys designated for the invasion force sailed not under a cloak of fear, but under a canopy of Allied air supremacy and naval dominance. The German Naval Command knew an invasion was coming, but their primary offensive weapon, the U-boat, was incapable of mounting any meaningful reconnaissance or disruptive campaign. Dönitz could only order a handful of boats to form a symbolic patrol line in the western approaches. In June 1944, they achieved nothing and suffered losses. This security allowed for the greatest military accumulation in history. By June 6, 1944, over 1.5 million American troops alone were stationed in Britain. The harbors and estuaries of western England were choked with landing craft, tanks, trucks, and ammunition stocks, all delivered across the Atlantic that the hunter-killer groups had secured. The victory in the Battle of the Atlantic was, therefore, the first and most crucial campaign of D-Day. It was the campaign that made all other campaigns possible. Faced with this strategic oblivion, Dönitz placed his final hopes in technological salvation. The Type XXI Electroboot and the Type XXII. These were not merely improved U-boats, they were revolutionary. The Type XXI, with its streamlined hull, massive battery capacity, Schnorchel, and advanced sonar, could cruise submerged at 17 knots for over an hour and maintain a silent 5 knots for days. It could theoretically fire torpedoes from 50 meters depth using hydrocaustic data alone. It was designed to render the Allied anti-submarine tactics, built around forcing a boat to dive and then wearing it down, obsolete. The Type XXII was a smaller, coastal version of the same concept. But the wonder weapon arrived in the shadow of total war. Allied bombing devastated the shipyards and component factories. The boats were rushed into production with severe technical flaws. Their advanced systems were unreliable. More critically, they arrived far too late. The first operational Type XXI, U-2511, embarked on its first war patrol on May 3, 1945. It received Dönitz's ceasefire order while maneuvering for an attack on a British cruiser group. Its captain, Korvettenkapitän Adalbert Schnee, conducted a dummy attack, coming within 500 meters of HMS Norfolk without being detected, then slipped away. it was a chilling demonstration of what might have been, and a final testament to the ingenuity of the U-boat designers. But it was a demonstration without consequence. The war ended before a single Type XXI could fire a shot in anger. The final accounting was rendered in the cold arithmetic of war. The U-boats had sunk approximately 2,779 Allied merchant ships, totaling 14.1 million tons, and 175 naval vessels. It was a staggering achievement of destruction, but the cost was the near total destruction of the U-boat arm itself. More importantly, they had failed in their strategic objective to sever the Atlantic lifeline. The Allies, through a combination of monumental shipbuilding, technological brilliance, code breaking, and the aggressive doctrine of the hunter-killer group, had not only kept the lifeline open, but had turned the ocean into a conduit for their own overwhelming power. The hunters of the deep had themselves been hunted to the brink of extinction. The story of the U-boats and the hunter-killer groups is not merely a tale of naval combat, it is a parable of modern warfare, a clear-eyed lesson in how advantages gained, lost, and won anew. It demonstrates that no single weapon, no matter how terrifying or effective, exists in a vacuum. It exists within a system, a constantly evolving ecosystem of detection, intelligence, production, and doctrine. The U-boat's early dominance was the triumph of a simple, brilliant tactical innovation. The wolfpack exploiting a specific vulnerability in Allied defenses. For a time, it mastered its environment, but warfare is a dialogue. The Allied response was not a single answer, but a holistic, system-wide adaptation. They built ships faster than they could be sunk. They developed radar to see in the dark and Huff-Duff to hear through the ether. They broke the enemy's most secret codes, and crucially, they evolved their doctrine from passive defense to relentless offensive hunting. The escort carrier and the support group were not just new tools, they were the physical embodiment of a new mindset. They closed the Atlantic gap not just with aircraft, but with aggressive intent. This battle was ultimately decided not in the hearts of brave sailors, though courage was abundant on both sides, but in the shipyards of Baltimore, the laboratories of MIT, the quiet huts of Bletchley Park, and the command rooms of Western approaches. It was a war of factories, of scientists, of mathematicians, and of organizational will. The men in the U-boats and the hunter-killer groups were the sharp end of this vast, impersonal effort. They fought and died in the cold water and howling wind, while the real contest was waged over production schedules, circuit diagrams, and lines of ciphertext. The lesson echoes beyond the salt spray and depth-charged tremors of the North Atlantic. It tells us that technological superiority is fleeting, that tactics must evolve or die, and that the side which best integrates its intelligence, its industry, and its fighting spirit into a coherent, adaptive system will, in the end, prevail. The German U-boat arm laughed at the convoys until the day the convoy system learned to hunt, and in that reversal lies a timeless truth of conflict. The hunter can always become the prey, and security is never a static condition, but a relentless, hard-won achievement. The Atlantic was silent once more, but its depths held the bones of both the hunters and the hunted, a permanent memorial to the war that was won not by a single battle, but by this unyielding will to see, to understand, and to adapt.